About me, I am the creator of the CapFX on social media. It's generally on TikTok, but I do branch out to Instagram and YouTube as well. I just post about the character, generally focusing on the comics, though I do branch out into other stuff as it applies. And I also run the online museum, the Cap Fan Museum, which just has a bunch of biographies and displays about different things about Captain America. If you can't tell, I'm a little obsessed about the character. But this all had to start somewhere. It started years ago when I decided, I had interest in the character, and I decided that I wanted to do a full read-through of the Captain America series, which is a lot of work. There's over 750 issues. There were a little bit less than that when I started, but still, it's a lot to go through. And in particular, there was one moment where I was reading an issue from the 40s during World War II. And in this issue, they kept mentioning something called the WAC. And each time I read it, I just kept thinking, what the heck is a WAC? Particularly one where it says a WAC Louis. It's basically a foreign language. So I looked it up and learned about the Women's Army Corps, which was an organization in the military made specifically for women during World War II. And Louis is lieutenant. It's just a slang thing. And I just found this fascinating because I had never heard of the WAC before this. Granted, maybe we had talked about it in my high school history classes, and I had just been too nervous about asking Sydney from homeroom out to the Christmas dance. But still, I had learned something because of a comic book. And as I made my way through the series, it kept happening, where I would learn about places and events that I had just never heard about before. All because I wanted to learn more about a comic character. Now, I think this would happen with a number of characters as you read through their entire history, but I think Captain America in particular is good for this for a few reasons. First of all, he's just an old character. He's been around since the 40s. There are a few heroes that have been around longer than him, but not many. So just for sheer volume, he's going to get a lot of US history. But more than that, I think it has to do with what Captain America stands for. Being so tied to the idea of a country and the nation, I feel that writers and creators are pushed to use him for commentary and critique on things that are going on in the world. In particular, Steve Englehart, he was the writer during the Watergate scandal, and would later say of this, "I was writing a man who believed in America's highest ideals at a time when America's president was a crook. I could not ignore that." When writing about Captain America, you can't help but write about America. This is one thing I want to get clear before going into the whole thing, though, is none of this should be viewed as direct statements from the authors. There's going to be times, like with Steve Englehart on the previous slide, where things were deliberate choices by the authors to reference real-world events. However, I think there's a lot of times where there's just things going on in the world that influence the writers and make them talk about things that they might not have before and maybe just do it subconsciously. So unless I specify otherwise, please view this as dots that I've connected rather than declarations of what the authors meant, just because I don't know what they were thinking at the time. But with all that said, let's learn more about Captain America, starting at the beginning. Captain America Comics #1 was published on December 20th of 1940 and was created by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. Oh, that was a little too far, sorry. And in my opinion, this image is the most political statement made in any comic book ever. And the reason for that is, this was nearly a year before Pearl Harbor happened. So the US wasn't yet fully involved in World War II. We had things like the Cash and Carry where we were helping out the Allies, but as far as full-on troop involvement, we were not doing that. And I think we take it a little for granted now that Hitler isn't just a bad guy. He's the bad guy of world history. But back then, this wasn't so clear. And furthermore, he wasn't just punching Hitler. He had been deliberately designed to punch Hitler. Joe Simon would later talk about how when he was creating new characters, he liked to start with the villains and then work off of that. So he was working, trying to figure out a new villain for someone to fight against, and then realized that there was already someone that was perfectly terrible over in Europe causing problems. Why not start with him? And so we got this. Funny enough, Joe Simon's boss was worried about publishing this image, not just for the political implications, but he was worried that with all that was going on over in Europe, that Hitler might die before it hit the stands. But like I said, it wasn't a foregone conclusion that we would get involved in World War II, and there were a number of people that weren't happy about Hitler getting punched. Biggest of these was a group called the German American Bund. This was a political organization founded in the 1930s, and it was the American branch of the Nazi Party. And I don't mean that just in the way that people in online discourse will call each other Nazis over the smallest disagreements. This was literally the Nazi Party. And it wasn't necessarily a small group either. Like, they were definitely a minority, but they had a rally at Madison Square Garden in 1939 in which 20,000 people were in attendance. So it's a big group. And to give you an idea of what this group was about, they were full-blown Nazis, with the final speaker saying that their goal was a white Gentile-ruled United States. After the publication of Captain America Comics 1, this group was not happy and sent multiple death threats to the creators. One of these threats in particular was leveled against Jack Kirby. One day while at the office, he received a phone call. And on the other line, the guy said, "Hey, you're the guy who makes Captain America? Me and my friends are waiting in the lobby to beat you up." Kirby's response, "Okay, I'll be right down." Jack Kirby was a tough guy. He grew up on the streets and street gangs getting in fights, so he was not just ready, he was ready to punch some Nazis. Unfortunately or fortunately, I don't, what you view may be different. There was nobody there when he went down. But the threats continued to the point that the FBI was called in to investigate because these threats were deemed so serious. Now, while there were the literal Nazis, there were also just people who didn't want to get involved in World War II. For a lot of them, World War I was very much still in their memories, and they didn't want to get involved in another, quote, European war. There was a Gallup poll at the time that estimated that about 84% of the US public didn't want to send troops overseas. There was a feeling that Germany needed to be stopped, and so there were groups such as the Committee to Defend America by Aiding the Allies, who wanted to aid the Allies, but they wanted to do it through financial support and sending supplies, not through troops. And another similar group, the America First Committee, said that American democracy can only be preserved by keeping out of war abroad. But with all that, there was support for the war. There was the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940, which was the first peacetime draft in the US. So the government clearly saw that there were signs that we might get involved. Furthermore, there were nearly 1 million copies of Captain America Comics 1 that were sold, which was huge for a new character. So apparently, a lot of people liked the idea of Hitler getting punched. And in response to the death threats that were sent to the creators, Mayor LaGuardia told them that they would receive protection from New York's finest and told them that they were doing good work. Since we weren't yet involved in the war when these comics started, a lot of these initial stories focused more on spies and sabotage rather than actual combat. So we had American factories getting blown up. Our friends from the German American Bund made an appearance threatening and harassing those who wouldn't join them. And people were selling out to the Nazis. In particular, Captain America's most well-known villain, the Red Skull, didn't start out with his current backstory of being Hitler's right-hand man. Instead, he was an American businessman who had been bribed by the Nazis to give faulty equipment to the military. And in addition to all that, there were just general crime and murder stories. It wasn't all focused on the Nazis. The US's hands-off involvement in World War II ended with the Pearl Harbor attack on December 7th of 1941. The US would declare war on Japan the next day, and on the 11th, Germany and Italy would declare war on the US in return, bringing us fully into World War II. It took a few months due to publishing lead time, but Hideki Tojo soon joined Hitler as being one of the few political leaders to be punched by Captain America on the cover of a comic book. And with the inclusion of the Japanese as the enemy in the comics, we see some pretty nasty racial caricatures of them. You know, at the most benign, they were just like colored as a neon yellow, which could be, you know, just attributed to coloring technology. But then in a lot of their appearances, they're also shown with fangs and claws, making them look pretty monstrous. This was also directed a bit at the Germans, though in my opinion a little more benign, where they're just, you know, big lips and noses looking kind of goofy versus monstrous. Another thing to change once the US entered the war was the inclusion of ads for war bonds and stamps. All of the issues started having these little, you can't see my pointer, these little inclusions in the very panels advertising the war bonds and stamps. Then you had a full-page ad with a letter from the Secretary of the Treasury asking people to support the war financially. And there was this giant 2-page ad in which the publishers told people to buy fewer comics to then donate that money to the war effort. And then at the bottom, it's can't read it even from where I'm at, but it broke down the cost of different supplies in relation to the price of a comic book, saying, you know, a rifle takes, or a bag takes 35 comics to buy. And now we get back to the thing that started this whole presentation, the Women's Army Corps. It was founded in 1942 and was initially started as the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, and was meant for a way to have women serve in combat, or not in combat, precisely. The idea was that women could go in and take the roles that men were performing, such as radio operators and typists, and so they could perform those roles, and then the men could go out and fight on the front lines. The program was incredibly successful and was soon reorganized and rebranded as just the Women's Army Corps. And in my opinion, some of the coolest things about this is the reasons why women served. 1 in 5 of them had a male relative who was serving in the war and felt that by helping get more men on the front lines, the war would be over sooner, and so then their loved ones could return home. Some of them had lost relatives in the attack on Pearl Harbor or the Bataan Death March. One woman even served because her son had been injured in a car accident and wasn't able to serve in the military, so she decided to serve and represent the family. Kind of like a reverse Mulan scenario. And of course, many women served because they wanted to serve their country. You know, patriotism isn't a uniquely masculine trait. As the word went on, conserving and recycling became also much more of a focus, and so the comics helped in this as well. When the comics first started, there was a program you could do where you would send in a little bit of money on a dime to join the Sentinels of Liberty Club, in which you'd get a nice shiny metal badge and you'd get like a club charter. But in about 1943, due to the metal shortages, they had to discontinue the Sentinels of Liberty badge. And the charter would follow a few months after that. And including with the conservation was also recycling. And so they included instructions on how to best recycle materials such as boxes, magazines, and newspapers. As a bit of an aside, this is one of the reasons why comics from this time are so rare now, despite the fact that there were hundreds of thousands printed. They literally gave you instructions on how to recycle them. In May of 1945, Germany surrendered, and Japan surrendered in August of the same year. And so, without a war, what happens to America's super soldier? The same thing that happened to all the other soldiers. He went home and resumed a normal life, or at least as normal of a life as you can have being a costume superhero. But now his day job was no longer a soldier on an army base. Instead, he was a teacher at a school. And then he also started to settle down a little bit. His longtime love interest, Betsy Ross, actually became his new crime-fighting partner, Golden Girl. And the two finally had their first kiss.
Woo!
After the war, though, the popularity of superhero comics started to drop off, and other genres started to become more popular. So to try and keep up with this, Captain America stories started to change. We had some fantasy stories similar to like Gulliver's Travels. There were sci-fi alien invasions and melodrama-filled romance stories. Furthermore, as we moved away from the idea of superheroes, Captain America himself starts to take less of a role in many of these stories. In some of them, he's just a floating head caption box narrating a story without actually taking part in it. This eventually made its way even to the title, where in issue 74, it was retitled as Captain America's Weird Tales, really trying to latch onto that growing horror genre. And again, continuing with his less involvement in the stories, this issue with the Green Monster, Captain America doesn't appear in it at all. It's just his name on the title. These changes weren't enough to keep sales going, and so the series was canceled in 1949. But in 1954, they decided to bring him back. And at this time, this is during some tense times of the Cold War. And so the new menace in the American psyche were communists. So Captain America got a new byline of Captain America Commie Smasher. Now this was after the Korean War and before the Vietnam War, so there wasn't an official combat or conflict for Cap to fight in. This meant he was again dealing more with spies and sabotage rather than actual overseas battles. Something a little bit different though is that in these issues, communism is the complete focus. With the World War II era, even during the height of the war, they would have times for just other crime stories. But not in the Commie Smasher era. Every single story dealt with the communists as the villains, trying to destroy America through deception and violence. And I can only assume that this was due to the rise of McCarthyism, where many people, particularly those in artistic careers such as writers and actors, were being accused of having communist sympathies, losing their jobs and reputation. So I think this was the publishers trying to be like, look, we hate communists. Clearly, we hate communists. This hyper-patriotism, however, wasn't enough to keep the series going, and it was canceled after only 3 issues. But in the 60s, superheroes started getting popular again. This is the time when heroes such as Spider-Man, the Hulk, and the Avengers were formed. And so they decided to bring Captain America back. He came back first in Avengers issue 4, and then started receiving his own solo series again a few months later. This is also where the idea of him being a man out of time was introduced, as the explanation for his extended absence was that he had been frozen in a block of ice and put in suspended animation for years. And believe it or not, this also has a little bit of real-world parallels. Jack Kirby, who was one of the co-creators, left for a time, and then was working on the series again, he himself felt like a man out of time. He hadn't been frozen in a block of ice or anything, but he had been a young man when Captain America was first created, whereas at this time he was reaching more middle age. And so, like many of us as we get older, the world starts to seem different and it's no longer the one we grew up in. And at this time, the Vietnam War was rarely mentioned, only appearing in a couple issues. This is very much in contrast to the World War II and even Commie Smasher era, where the real world conflicts were addressed and were the focus of things, but not Vietnam. For all that it played a role in the comics, the Vietnam War might as well not have existed. This one is probably due to the fact that the Vietnam War was incredibly unpopular, particularly amongst college-age students, who were a large portion of Marvel's readership. With the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and events that led up to it and followed it, representation became a much bigger deal in comics. And so for Captain America, this meant he received a new crime-fighting partner in the Falcon, who was one of the first black superheroes in mainstream comics. And he wasn't just a sidekick to Cap, he was a full-on partner, to the point that about a year and a half after the character's introduction, the series was retitled to Captain America Falcon. And the stories would split their time between Captain America and the Falcon, giving the Falcon time to develop his own villains and plot threads, totally independent of Captain America. In the 70s, we had the Watergate scandal. As I was reading and preparing for this presentation, I saw it described in one place that President Nixon really should have been known as the president who ended the Vietnam War, or the president who got us to the moon. But because of Watergate, he's known as the president who resigned in order to avoid impeachment. This event went so far that it's even changed our language. Now we put gate at the end of a word to indicate some sort of scandal. Like we had Emailgate with Hillary Clinton's emails, we had Deflategate in the NFL, and we probably would have had something with the OceanGate submarine if it weren't for the fact that it already had gate at the end of it. But with the Watergate, this was one instance where it was made clear by Steve Englehart that it was meant to reflect what was going on in the real world. In the real world, we had the Committee for the Re-election of the President, which was often given the disparaging acronym CREEP. And in the comics, Captain America soon found himself in conflict with a political organization called the Committee to Regain America's Principles, or CRAP. Cap soon learns that this committee is behind a plot to try and overthrow the government and take over the United States. And so he fights against them, and it culminates in a battle with their masked leader in the White House, in the Oval Office. And then when Captain America wins the fight, he unmasks the leader, and it was never shown, as it was never outright said in the comics, but it was heavily implied and later confirmed by Steve Englehart that it was President Nixon who was the evil leader. So much like America in general, upon realizing their president was a crook, Captain America was shattered. His faith in America was shattered to the point that he stopped being Captain America. He totally left the mantle behind and took on a new costume persona of Nomad, specifically choosing that name to distance himself from the idea of a country. He was also apparently distancing himself from his shirt color based on that massive V-neck. Of course, you can't have Captain America comics for very long without having Captain America, so he would soon return to the role. But even in this, it was with the specific realization that in order to really protect America's dream, the dream of America, he would have to fight threats within America as well as outside of it. In 1980, we had the New Mexico State Penitentiary riot, which was the most violent prison riot in US history, with 33 inmates dying and about 200 others being injured in the riot. There were a few reasons for this riot to happen. One of which was that the prison was very unsanitary. There were mice and cockroach infestations everywhere, and the facility was housing about 200 more prisoners than it had been designed for. Furthermore, there had been a reduction of rehabilitative programs, so the prisoners had less things to occupy their times and to better themselves. And there was a pretty lousy prisoner assignment where the first-time offenders would be put with like the violent repeat offenders. And so it was just a mess all around. And this made its way to the comic where Captain America went to prison. Oh. He wasn't a prisoner, instead he was working with the prison to test their security system and see how robust it was. But in the issue, it takes a lot of time to show how important rehabilitative programs were. And in particular, there was one young inmate who Steve befriended while in there. This inmate had been brought in on his first crime, but the other more hardened criminals that were in the prison kept talking about how they were gonna corrupt this kid and they were gonna show him all the ropes of criminality. The 80s were also a time in which unions were villainized and depowered. In 1981, we had the strike by the Professional Air Traffic Controller Organization, who were wanting better pay and better working conditions. But President Reagan declared the strike to be a danger to national safety, said it was illegal, and ordered them back to work. About 11,000 of these workers refused to return to work, maintaining the strike, and were then fired by President Reagan. This in turn led to many other employers stopping negotiating with unions and instead deciding to fire them. And then that in turn led to a reduction in the number of strikes. In the 70s, there would be an average about 250 strikes per year in the US, but by the 90s, that number had dropped to about 35. And then that number continued dropping through the years and has only recently started rising up again. So for Captain America, this meant a new villainous organization called the Serpent Society, which was literally a union for supervillains. This organization was made to ensure that these villains got proper pay and benefits, and gave them, it offered them some supervillain specific benefits, such as the promise that if they were ever captured, they would be broken out of prison.
That sounds like a good benefit.
I would like that benefit.
Around the same time, we also had the introduction of another group called the Watchdogs, which were a right-wing terrorist organization. This group said that they were against things like pornography, the teaching of evolution, and abortion, but would fight for these things by blowing up buildings and murdering people. And this came just a few years after some other such groups in the US had come about. There was a multi-day siege against a group called the Covenant of the Sword and the Arm of the Lord. I always get those words mixed up. There's a lot of words in there. But they were being brought in for weapons violations and terrorist acts. There was another group called the Order, which funded themselves through bank robberies, counterfeiting, all to fund their operations to murder people in an attempt to take over, to throw down the federal government. In the 80s, we also had a rise of violent action heroes in general media, such as RoboCop and Rambo. This is also around the time that the PG-13 rating was introduced, which quickly became popular because it was still somewhat family friendly. It had a lower age rating than R, but it had the promise of an edge that the PG and G movies wouldn't offer. And Cap soon started facing off against similarly violent anti-heroes. People who were not just willing, but sometimes even eager to kill those that they fought against. The tamest of these was the Super Patriot, who was another patriotic hero meant to Captain America's old-fashioned values. We also had the Scourge, a person who would actively seek out supervillains and kill them after each murder, declaring justice is served. In one instance in particular, the Scourge went to a bar for supervillains, because that's a thing, and murdered 18 villains in one night. Finally, we had the AmeriCop, a former police officer who decided that the law wasn't sufficiently protecting people, and so went on a violent rampage to eliminate criminals rather than just imprison them. With this rise in violent heroes, and both in movies and in comics, there was a call to the writer Mark Gruenwald asking him to make Captain America more like Rambo, aka people were wanting him to be more violent and more brutal. Mark, however, felt that this would be contrary to the spirit of Steve Rogers as Captain America. But he found a workaround in the Super Patriot from the previous slide, John Walker. In the comics, Steve was more or less forced out of the Captain America role, and John Walker was put in his place, allowing a more violent version of Captain America to be present. And this year-long arc took a lot of time to examine why we wouldn't actually want this level of violence from our protectors. And so Steve Rogers was returned to the role. In about 1985, crack cocaine was developed and quickly started an epidemic because it was such a popular drug for a few different reasons. First of all, it was much more affordable than other street drugs. It offered a faster high, and then it also was highly addictive. This popularity resulted in a lot of conflict over distribution, where different groups would fight with each other over territory and customers. And in 1989, we had a drug bust in which 21 tons of cocaine were seized, which was at the time the biggest drug bust, but we've since gone on to break that record.
Yay!
And what better way? Well, at this time, we also had the development of government measures to try and combat drugs, such as the DARE program, to try and teach the dangers of drugs. And what better way is there to show the dangers of drugs than to have Captain America go on a multi-day drug rampage?
Very good.
So obviously Cap wouldn't deliberately take drugs, but he was exposed to a new experimental drug called ice, which was more potent and deadly than other street drugs at the time. And this arc, it's a 6-issue series, shows Captain America go from his normal, happy, helping self to a paranoid insomniac who actively fights against his friends until he can get rehabilitated. Although he gets rehabilitated through sci-fi technology rather than rehab. But as a side plot, we also had the supervillains, the Kingpin and the Red Skull, fighting each other over who would get the right to distribute this new drug in New York. And it ends in a literal fistfight between the two of them to decide. On September 11th of 2001, 2 planes hit the World Trade Centers. Another hit the Pentagon, and a 4th was brought down by the passengers before the attack could be completed. Soon after this, the US would begin military operations in multiple countries as part of the War on Terror. And Captain America had to respond. The writers had a totally different arc planned out in which they were going to take the character, but after after September 11th, they realized they couldn't use that anymore and completely shifted gears. This new story arc started with Steve Rogers helping with the cleanup and rescue at ground zero of the attacks. Furthermore, he was also quick to combat the Islamophobia that was arising at the time, helping stop hate crimes against citizens. In the real world, Muslims would also be the target of multiple hate crimes, and the rate of hate crimes would increase by 1,000% in the aftermath of the attacks. Furthermore, even though this was shortly after, only a few months after the attacks, there would already be some critique of the US's actions in the War on Terror. Cap would fight against fictional terrorists, but the fictional leader Al-Tariq would go on to make a bit of a prophetic statement where he said that when innocent Americans died, it was viewed as a tragedy, but when his people died, they were viewed as collateral damage. And over the course of the War on Terror, a 2023 report estimated that about 75% of deaths from the War on Terror would be non-combatants. And then in 2007, we had the death of Captain America. This came in the aftermath of a company-wide event called the Civil War. I don't want to go into a whole lot about what the Civil War is, as that's not the focus of Cap's solo series, but it was a story that was in and of itself a bit of a critique of measures such as the Patriot Act that had been taken in the aftermath of the attacks. And so many people viewed this death of Captain America to be indicative of how people were feeling about America in general. This story gained some wide press coverage with multiple news outlets covering it. And Joe Simon was interviewed about it, saying it was a real shame that we really needed him now. We wouldn't be without a Captain America for long, as Cap's old crime-fighting partner, Bucky Barnes, would take up the role as Captain America. But he would have his work cut out for him, much like Steve had before. In 2007, we had the Nisour Square massacre, in which members of Blackwater Security Consulting, who were a group that was working for the US military in Iraq, fired upon and killed 17 Iraqi civilians. The Iraqi government, understandably, was outraged at this event and stated that too often these third-party contractors were too quick to fire and would often shoot first and ask questions later. And sure enough, Bucky soon went up against his own security contractors in a group called Kingmeyer Securities, which were brought into fictional New York as a police force, and they soon came into conflict against unarmed civilians in a protest. We also had the housing crisis of the late 2000s, where there was a housing bubble and many people were buying houses with the idea that if they fell behind on the payments, they could just sell the house for more than it was worth. At the time, we had a lot of subprime lending going on, and this was fueled by the fact that these mortgage companies would often take these riskier loans that they were giving out and sell them to third-party companies so that they could pass off the risk. as the housing market crashed, many people defaulted and went bankrupt, and this led to a massive recession. And in the comics, we similarly had a housing crisis, although this one was also helped along by a supervillain, because bankers aren't evil enough on their own, apparently. Because of the recession that was happening, President Obama and Congress passed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act in 2009. And they were trying to stimulate the economy, and this required massive spending by the government, around $700 billion. There was a bit of outrage at this, and many people started protesting in the Tea Party protests over this spending. And sure enough, Bucky soon has to contend against his own protesters who are protesting about some sort of tax thing. And this was pretty clearly inspired by it, because not only was it an anti-tax protest, but some of the signs in these protests were lifted directly from signs at the Tea Party protests. In 2009, we had the reintroduction of the DREAM Act, which was a measure that was proposed to help those who had been brought into the country illegally as young children, so they didn't have a legal status in the United States, but had been here for so long that they were more part of the United States than their own country. This had been brought up a few different times for this, and again in 2009 it was shut down. But generally, this time, President Obama signed into act the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which would give many of the same protections that the DREAM Act would offer. Now, Captain America at this time had returned to life, because nobody stays dead in comics, but this New York had him adopt a young boy, who he rescued from a supervillain. But not only does he now have to raise this child, he had to do so in an alternate dimension, where he and his son were viewed as outsiders and were treated with hostility. But not only was Captain America an immigrant to a different dimension, but there were also a lot of flashbacks and a lot of dealing with Steve's status as the son of immigrants. It had flashbacks to his childhood, showing some of the struggles they went through, and in certain conflicts he brought up that he was the children of immigrants and that immigrants were not the threat that many people thought they were. Now I know Steve just barely came back on this slide, but due to certain shenanigans, he was magically turned into an old man and could no longer be Captain America. And so Sam Wilson now took over as Captain America. And this thread of immigration would continue as Sam started his own series. It started off more in the real world, more grounded, with a villainous group called the Sons of the Serpent, targeting immigrants who were trying to cross the border. And in addition, we had the introduction of a new character, Joaquin Torres, as the new Falcon. And he specifically identified himself as one of those dreamers. In the early and mid-2010s, we had the deaths of Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Eric Gardner, and Markia Boyd. And due to their deaths, the movement and protests of Black Lives Matter were started. And at this time, the police's use of force was heavily criticized, as they had been involved in many of these deaths. For Captain America, this meant the return of the Americop, who we saw many slides ago. But this time, instead of being a vigilante bent on his own form of justice, it's a branch of law enforcement. And while they're no longer outright killing those that they are bringing down, they were still very much brutal and racist in their actions. And this arc culminates with them arresting, after brutally attacking, a young black hero named Rage, who then has to go to court and is quickly convicted despite his innocence and a lack of evidence to convict him. Around 2016, there was a spike in activity amongst white supremacist groups. And a lot of this has been attributed to the campaign and election of President Donald Trump. While he has gone on to state that he does not endorse these groups, he did make many promises that these groups took and used to empower themselves, such as his promise to build a wall between the US and Mexico. And furthermore, he would say things like, of Mexican immigrants, saying they're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some I assume are good people. So these actions and promises really fuel these groups. After Captain America was brought back to his youthful self by a being who could alter reality, it was soon revealed that there was more altering done to him, in which his past was magically rewritten so that he was a member of the villainous group Hydra. Hydra has changed throughout the years a bit, as at some points they've just been generic villain henchmen, but other times they've been extra evil Nazis. And at this point, this storyline, they were very much in white supremacist territory, committing hate crimes and blaming people of color for all the problems in America. And so Steve, now secretly a member of this group, used his influence to bring himself and help Hydra take over the United States. And what's the first thing that this evil Steve does as soon as he's in power? He puts up a couple of walls. Albeit these are magical and sci-fi walls, but they're still walls that are meant to keep out those who are viewed as a threat to Hydra's regime. Even after Steve was returned to his normal self, many of these things that we were just talking about would continue to be threads of the continuing series. We had more of the AmeriCops for police brutality, the Watchdogs made a return for white supremacy, a villain named Nuke showed up a bunch to critique the war on terror. And in addition, we have the introduction of a new villain, Alexa Lukin, who was a Russian woman who was intent on destroying Captain America and America in general. And this coming, again, just in the aftermath of the Trump election, in which Russia's involvement was very much a topic of debate, where people were wondering how much involvement they had had in changing the election. And that brings us more or less to present day. We had, about a year ago, these two series starring Steve and Sam as Captain America started about a year ago. And they've actually even just finished up recently in the last couple of months. And we had a new issue of Captain America just yesterday come out. And what we could start to talk about these, I think is a little too soon. You know, we're very much in the realm of history that we would want to be viewing these from. But I'm sure that in a few years, someone will read the Sam series and look at the biological weapon inside of it and view that as a representation of the hesitations people had around the COVID-19 vaccine. And maybe in another decade or so, people will read Steve's series and look at the villainous Outer Circle organization as an analogy for the Biden administration. And maybe in 80 years, someone will be reading this comic and see mention of something called Twitter, and wonder what the heck is a tweet, which will lead them on their own journey to learn more about Cap in America. Thank you. We got like 5, so we do have a little bit of time for questions. If you have a question, please come up to the mic, and once you're done asking your question, step out of the way so the next person can get up.
What's an event that, that's okay. What's an event you wish they had covered in a Captain America comic?
That is a very good question.
Too on the spot?
Maybe a little too on the spot, but I mean, my favorite stories are always the one that deal with like the question of what does it mean to be Captain America. So stories like when John Walker took over as Captain America, or the Nomad storylines, like these really delve into what does it even mean to be Captain America? What does the American dream mean?
Okay. I'll see if my brain just spaced my questions.
Is there an issue, like, as in a comic book or something, that you wish you could have changed in an issue of a comic?
Is there an issue I wish I could have changed of a comic? There is one in which it was with Sam Wilson, and his backstory was initially really good, even for the time period where he started out as a social worker and was a good guy. And so, you know, very much different from many of the stereotypes around black people And so that was one reason he was really good for representation. But then the author, Steve Englehart, who's normally like a really good author, like he's probably top 3 Captain America authors for me, he changed Sam's backstory to that he had been changed by the Red Skull and had previously been just a thug on the street, and it just felt like a total betrayal of Sam's character. And so that's, that's one that I wish would never have happened. They've since gone on to pretty well retcon it out of existence, but it was just a real shame that it ever happened.
I didn't want to cross the camera, but can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So you mentioned Captain America's girlfriend, her last, I guess, was her name Betsy Ross,
yeah.
right? No coincidence. Apart from the obvious name from the woman who sold the original flag for America, was she found out to be related at all to the Ross who persecuted the Hulk?
Yeah, so I don't know how many of you can hear the question, but so Betsy Ross, Cap's original love interest, basically shares the same name as the Hulk's love interest. To my knowledge, there's no connection of that, but with how much material out there, it would not surprise me if there's one random story where it's addressed.
How do you feel about the portrayal of Captain America in the movies that he's been in compared to how they portray him in the comics?
How do I feel about the movies compared to the comics? I feel like they did a really good job for the most part. Chris Evans did a great job portraying a very down-to-earth guy who wants to help people. And so there's definitely stuff that misses out, but I think that has to do more with the fact that you have only a few select movies versus 80 plus years of publishing history. So it's, I think for the time they had, that it was overall a good job.
What's Captain America's favorite food?
What's Captain America's favorite food? So that was the subject of my first Cap fact, and what really started because it was just a cool detail where Cap's favorite snack, at least, is cheese on whole wheat bread and a glass of milk. Though it never, what drives me nuts is it never states if if it's a toasted sandwich or if it's just raw and what type of milk it is.
It's American cheese, right?
It is American cheese. Yeah, it's pretty thick.
What's a Captain America villain from a long time ago you wish they'd bring back?
So, my favorite villain is one named the Tumbler. And he is my favorite because he is so lousy. Like, he was originally introduced in the 60s and he showed up like 1.5 times out. He shows up in like one panel for a story. Then the next story he shows up in is literally like a decade later and he's killed off. And then his brother comes back as the Tumbler to more or less avenge him. And in that one, it's also revealed that the original Tumbler was just pathetic. And I just love that for some reason. So I would love to have him brought back for a reason and still be just as pathetic and lame as he's always been. Okay, this has got to be the last question.
What's your favorite, most obscure, just most fun Captain America fun fact you got?
I mean, it was really probably that cheese sandwich one. Like,
The dinosaur one.
oh, there's also the dinosaur one. So there was one story in the 40s in which a Nazi had his brain transplanted into a dinosaur's body because they found a dinosaur that was still alive somehow.
For sure, yeah.
And they transplanted his brain into the dinosaur, which then went on a giant rampage. And that's just a story I feel like you can't get anywhere else. Okay, so thank you all for coming. If you want to see more from me, you can find me at CapFacts both on TikTok and YouTube, and as the Comic Captain on Instagram, or at the Captain America Fan Museum at capfanmuseum.com.
Thank you.
Good job.
So you just gotta press the X. Oh boy. Ugh. I clicked the button again.
You mentioned the Scourge.